Press my luck.
Giving a performance with an accordion, no less. So, thank you, John. My name is Lynn Mackey, for those of you who do not know me, and I'm standing in for our illustrious president, Leanne Despodes, who has a very bad respiratory illness. And I can't tell you how disappointed she is for not being here, because she's been doing a lot of correspondence with John. So, we're just excited that you're here tonight. And I just want to start this program by saying that this is so special because, you know, we do a lot of genealogical research, you know, of different pioneers of early Bailey's Harbor. But this is the first time that there was a discovery made of this kind of importance. So tonight you're in for a real treat. Before we start the program, I just want to thank Nancy Rafal, who's not here tonight, for doing the display cases in the Tuft House. And I invite all of you to go to the Tuft House because we have new summer displays. And one is of Bob McCurdy and his wood carvings. And then we also have authors of Bailey's Harbor. Phoebe Erickson is one of them. Our own, very own Patty Williamson, who is here tonight, is featured. And then there is also Wallace and Helen Grange. And I give thanks to Nancy Rafal for doing that because she is now the Poet Laureate of Door County. So this was a labor of love for her. I also want to mention a little housekeeping thing, that all of our programs are free, but we do have a jar in the back for any free will contributions. It helps with mailings and treats and those kinds of things. So thank you in advance. Like I said, Bailey's Harbor has had many successful forays, but I think this is one of the most successful we've had. And I'm just going to read you a brief intro, and this is from the summer of 2017. And this was in our Bailey's Harbor Historical Society newsletter. And it goes as follows. Bailey's Harbor Historical Society received a request from John Fons this summer to help find the original settler cabin that his great-grandfather built in Bailey's Harbor over 100 years ago. He supplied a print of a photo of the structure. Hoping that this would be helpful, I conferred with Lynn Mackey and we concocted a plan. And this plan was that we kind of figured that there was a relationship with Martin Schramm because Pauline Fons was married to him. And so we thought of the older members of the Schramm family of whom we were going to get in contact with. And we also figured that this cabin was somewhere out in the Polish settlement. So we also looked at the town clerk. We asked for land records and we looked at those. Well, before we did anything about contacting the Schramm family, my husband and I went over to White Gull Inn for breakfast. And I said, well, let's take Highland Road home. And Leanne had given me a photo of the cabin. We got around this corner on Highland Road, and I said, there it is! Nice. And there it was. And we could kind of tell it was a cabin because it was like an off-center door. It had to be that. So we got out of the car and we kind of trespassed and walked around, and we thought, yes, this is it. So Leanne got in contact with John, and he came. He traveled here within a few days, and he came to the cabin, and it was proven that it was it because there was a stone carved with J. Fons 1909 was right next to the front door. It was an exciting conclusion for all of us. So, like I say, this program reminds us that we are all searching for our roots, and some of us are lucky enough to find them. This is one such story. So without further preamble, John, it's all yours.
My name is John Edwin Fons. I was born in Ludington, Michigan. I never knew the town. I never saw the town until I hitchhiked into it when I was 21 years of age. That was a long time ago. I was born to Lloyd Chancellor Fons and Vanita June Hanson Fons. My father was born on Washington Island, where at the time Grandpa Fons, Jack or John Fons, for whom I am named, was doing road construction, and he was also, although many men claim the honors, Gramps was actually one of the foremen on the buildings that Chester Thordarson Commission built on Rock Island. He was one of the foremen in charge of the boathouse. There were letters and such, and this presentation to you is not scripted, so I'll just intersperse with little stories. At a time of much lower water level, Mr. Thordarson wanted to go from Rock Island back over to Washington Island, and he didn't want to get wet, and there wasn't a boat available, so Grandpa put him on his shoulders and carried him across Jackson Harbor Strait there, to get him to back over to Washington Island. My father always, as a boy, always resented that because he thought Grandpa was sort of playing the clown there, but I never saw it that way. I just saw it as a prodigious feat of strength and determination on the part of my grandfather. My family moved around a lot. My father was in the oil business, and until I was a junior in high school, I never attended the same school 2 years in a row, either because I graduated from like elementary school to junior high or we moved to a different town. Every year, however, through my young childhood, the family would take its annual vacation to Washington Island, and it was like heaven. Even as a child, the quality of light, the sweetness of the air, the safety, the sanctuary of it all seemed extraordinary. After I left home and came of age, the idea of traveling really never left me, although I lived on a farm in Iowa for a number of years and I homesteaded that farm. The idea of being rootless and somehow functioning in this world always clung around me. I'm a writer by trade, and the first book I ever wrote I entitled A Tree Without Roots for that very reason. But I want to share with you some of those memories, and I want to make this a conversational program. The picture you had seen on the screen is the cabin. This is the log cabin that stands near the intersection of Highland Road and High Plateau, not more than about, 2 miles from here? And this is, as it was pictured, photographed probably about 55 or 60 years ago. It was in a dilapidated condition, and this is basically what I provided to the Bailey's Harbor Historical Society. Do you know what this place is, or have you ever seen it? Because this was, in our family history, this is where my grandfather, John Fons, was born, and 10 siblings. The cabin measures 21 feet square. They had 11 kids, 10 of them lived to adulthood. My great-grandfather built this in basically the late 1880s. His wife Susan, he and she are buried over here in the Bailey's Harbor Cemetery. And the idea of living in such a place, knowing the kind of winters we had last year and knowing they had the same kind of winters 100 and some odd years ago, challenges the imagination. It's really important to have a sense of home and place. It's not absolutely essential. We have 2 3-legged cats at our house, and a cat can walk around on 3. And a person can live without a sense of where they came from or where they belong. But Washington Island, for instance, or Door County, gave me something that was indelible, and often in a modern world rather awkward, because it probably made me a romantic idealist. And I can't get rid of it, because nobody's ever handed me a better vision of what it means to be happy on earth than to be a child in the care of loving parents and loving grandparents in a place like Washington Island, where every year when you go there, Grandma had a gallon pickle jar, except the pickles were gone, and one was filled with oatmeal cookies and one with chocolate chip. And those wonderful little brightly colored custard dishes in the refrigerator with the custard in them sprinkled with nutmeg. It isn't all idealistic and wonderful. We had a beloved uncle, a great uncle, Del Klingenberg, who my father always typified as a very kind man. He was very kind to me, my father would say. But Del's life took turns that were not so kind to him, and every summer when we would come up here, we would go looking for Uncle Del, because he was an itinerant cherry picker, or any odd job he could come up with. And we would find him. My sister is in the audience tonight, and she will remember how Dad would leave us in the car with Mom, and he would go walk out under the trees to find Del and talk with him a little bit, and sooner or later my father's hand would go into his hip pocket and he would bring out his wallet and hand Del a little money. And Del's buried on the island now, along with a lot of other people. But there were people like Uncle Arnold and Lydia who lived on the island. Lydia was my grandmother's sister. I never saw Arnold wear anything but a tank top, white t-shirt, and dingy, greasy dungarees. I don't ever think I remember him standing up. He just was always in the same place, in the same little house. But you see, as a writer and as a human being, character is so incredibly important. And people have a right to be who they are. It's essential that they be who they are. And so these are loving memories now, as were people who were not even related to us. Dave Lucky was the pilot on the ferry boats when there was just the Griffin, and his wife, Carmen. Carmen was a big lady, and we used to go to her house on the island to buy the worms we used when we went fishing. We'd go down to her basement, and she had these galvanized tubs, and she'd lift up the peat moss, and the worms were the size of snakes. You could bait about 6 hooks with one of Carmen's worms. But a woman of some taste, in their backyard there, they had this magnificent alabaster statue of these delicate ladies holding a dish up in the air, and it was made of alabaster. And Dad told her, he says, Carmen, he says, you've got to get that inside your house. He says, it's out in the winter. He says, somebody's going to take a shot at it with a .22. I have no idea what became of it. But when we would go to the island as a boy, 8 years of age, Dave would greet Dad because they grew up together as kids as though a year had never passed, and I would be invited up into the pilot house, and they would perch me up on that stool, and I got to put my hands on that wheel, and as an 8-year-old boy steering the ferry boat over to Washington Island, you believe, okay. You believe in castles, you believe in knights, you believe in dragons, you believe in all kinds of things because you've seen it and you've done it. My grandfather hated the Arabaki when it was launched by the Richter family because he said it looked like a shoebox and it was no kind of boat at all. He anticipated and probably would have gloried in it had it sunk, but it's still out there. And these are the little things I want to share with you, although they may seem to have nothing to do with an old log cabin outside Bailey's Harbor. I teach writing from time to time at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and the rules of the game are very simple. You each have a story. You may go to a place called a living history farm, and you may enjoy seeing how life was perhaps lived 150 years ago or so, but you are living history. You're living it now. And each one of you has a story that only you can tell, a history which only you can know. Whatever I say up here tonight will be just one point on the compass. I can give you just a glimpse through one little keyhole at what it was like and what it felt like for me to know someplace like that cabin or the people who came from it. If you write it down, and you can do that on a 3x5 card or a stack of them, you can do it on blank paper, any way you want, or you can spend a lot of money and you do it on a computer. But if you write it down and you put it in an envelope, and that envelope goes into a drawer, and it's under the socks you never wear, the chances are pretty good that people you never meet and will never know may read that, and you may change their lives. Some of the greatest pieces of literature ever written are coming out of diaries and personal reflections that people have made. It's valuable. It's an archive. It's treasure. It's not counted in monetary terms, but if you don't do that, and let's be frank, you close your eyes for the last time, I'm asking you what's going to happen to that story. So in order to endow those you love or the world you came into, I encourage you to tell that story, that history, that living history which is your own. Part of mine is that, yes, I'm a very lucky man to be able to stand here and point to that cabin behind me. There's a lady here who is my beloved, Jane Meyer. This is a history lesson, by the way. This is part of my history. Jane and I have known each other for 10 years, and the way we met was at my parents' 60th wedding anniversary on the 95th floor of the John Hancock building. Because history can be kind of funny, okay? And there were these two lovely ladies there, Jane and her mother. I'd never met either one of them. They knew every single thing there was to know about me. I mean, it was daunting, a bit appalling, and I couldn't fib. And the reason for that was that in World War II, my father served as an officer in the United States Navy, and he had command of a PT boat in the South Pacific. And Jane's father met him there, and he also commanded a boat, and they became best friends, and that friendship lasted through all the years and involved their wives, our mothers, and my mother and Jane's mother wrote letters to each other every week, certainly every month, and they kept all those letters. The Meyers were a very loquacious family, and they talked to one another, so they shared those letters. I didn't know anything. I didn't know. And so I meet these lovely ladies. And that's history, you see. It's fun. It's not dour, it's not morbid, it's not all past, it's living into the present. And again, as a storyteller, the passion that I share for this subject is that if you go to Washington Island and you go to Schoolhouse Beach and you look over that lovely water, and slightly off to the right, which is the northeast corner of Washington Harbor, and about 35 feet of water, there's the wreckage of a boat. The Pride, a three-masted schooner that sank in November of 1901. My great uncle was captain of that boat, Christopher Klingenberg. They came into the harbor during a storm. They tried to tack out. She missed her stays, as they say. Piled up on the rocks, the crew went ashore through the rigging into the trees. No lives were lost, but the cargo went down. It was potatoes and lumber from the local farmers. And my great uncle quit the Maritimes, took a factory job in Milwaukee, and spent part of the rest of his life paying back the farmers whose crops he lost in that wreck. I love that guy. I love what he stood for. And the stone that Lynn referred to that's by the threshold of that cabin bears the name J. Fons 1909. I was telling Jane earlier today that my grandfather as a young teenage boy, could have taken paint and splashed it on a board. He could have taken a pocket knife and carved it in a board. But doggone it, he took a piece of iron and he scraped it into a rock. That's very much like him. He left home at the age of 15 out of that cabin to work in the lumber camps because he said at the time it was just as easy to starve somewhere else. And so I want to show you a couple things. This is a sledgehammer he used. It weighs 8 pounds. And a beloved uncle from the other side of the family always said of things like this, it's hell to pick up, but it goes down real easy. I use this, and I intend to continue to use it for the very reason that it was my grandfather's. I'm delighted to do so. In Madison, I'm working on a wagon. There'll be pictures of it here in a minute. The wagon was on the Meyer family farm near Milwaukee, the Meyer orchards. They're no longer there. There's a Walmart where the barn used to be. They knocked the barn over. But there was a wagon in that orchard that used to haul apples from the orchard to that barn where they used to sort them. And that wagon found its way into the backyard of the home where Jane grew up in Madison, until I came along about 10 years ago. And the same year Jane's mother died in that house, the wagon fell to the ground. It simply rotted to pieces. And looking at that pile of derelict lumber, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. You can burn the lumber, you can take the scrap iron to the curb, and the city of Madison will dutifully, and for your tax dollars well spent, carry all that to a landfill. But there was just enough of it left to begin to pattern and to rebuild that wagon, and I've undertaken to do that. But first, let me show you. That's the cabin as it appeared maybe 60 years ago. And that's the cabin as it appears today. You've probably all seen this driving down the road northwest of here. The property is now owned by a couple from Watertown, Daniel and Tierney Layler. They were kind enough to communicate with me after I made contact with them. And Jane and I walked on the property and we went in the cabin. It smells like chickens. But Mr. Tierney, or Mr. Layler rather, has since put a new roof on the cabin, and he's replacing some of the window units. So it will stand there pretty much as it is now, and bless his heart, a new roof on that structure will preserve it for a long time. So those are the bookends of what I'm talking to you about today. That's the cabin. And I can never express my gratitude enough to the Historical Society, to Leanne and to Lynn, for caring, for looking for that cabin for me. There's the project in Madison. That's what's left of oak timbers after 100 years or so out in the weather. It sat in the backyard, and there wasn't a whole lot left. The wagon wheels collapsed. And any way you looked at it, there wasn't a whole lot there. And I graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary. Forgive me, I tried to turn everything into a sermon. Life is like that, okay? It takes maintenance, it takes care, and no matter how well you maintain it, sometime things fall apart. So what are you going to do with it? What's the most expedient thing, of course, is just to get some lighter fluid and a wrecking bar. That's what's left of was left of the front end when the wheels collapsed. That large timber sticking out is an axle timber. Originally, it was solid oak, about 4 inches square and carved at the ends. And so the first job was to photograph it as it lay and draw it and begin to take measurements so that when I did disassemble it, I'd find my way back in. It's a little like Hansel and Gretel and the breadcrumbs. And so you get under it, and you put some scaffolding around it, and you pick it up. The wood was about the consistency of paper mache. I contacted an Amish wheelwright outside of Loganville, Wisconsin. It took him 1.5 years, and he made me 4 new wagon wheels. His name's Norman Yoder. And whereas in most farm lots, when you drive in, you see tire tracks. When you drive into Norman's farmyard, you see nothing but hoof prints because he's Amish. So I jacked the wagon up and put the new wheels under it. Put it on what we call cribbing to take all the weight off the wheels. And those are still the original axle timbers. You could put your fingers right through the mice and the insects had had their way for 100 years. But all the iron is original. Those are the original iron bands, the rims of the wagons, the hub bands, everything. And so you get a start and a sense of what it is. And today, it's starting to look like something because I've recarved the axle timbers and I've reset them, and I have a machine shop in the little town of Ixonia that makes the iron for me when I need it, and it's going to get rebuilt. I have one more picture, I think, to show you. There. The only piece of the wagon original to it that will remain is that black timber, and it's black from age. That's the same kind of oak as the rest of it is made of, but after 100 and some odd years, it's taken on that ancient look. And I want to do 2 things after we are done here. We're going to have a party when that wagon is done in the backyard of our property in Madison, and I want to invite you. So if you want to know when that party is going to be, I want you to sign up on the list, the piece of paper. And then there's something else a little trickier, but I'll go ahead and express the intention. I want to bring that wagon up here someday. I want you to see it here. I want to transport it up here. As I mentioned, my great-grandparents, John and Susan Fons, they immigrated from Poland. And it's amazing how much about yourself you learn by talking with other people. We're not born with the knowledge that we gain inherent within ourselves. You have to visit with people. You have to talk to people. And one of the people I've ended up talking with, I met him tonight about 40 minutes ago for the first time, is a cousin of mine, Michael Fons, and his wife Roxanne from Minnesota, because he was conversant with the Historical Society here. See how important this group is? So not only did you find my cabin, that old cabin for me, but you helped introduce me to my own cousin whom I didn't know. Through the Laylors who own this property, who own the cabin, I discovered that my great-grandparents had a mule named Joe. And that if Joe, if you took him anywhere in this area and just dropped the reins, that he'd find his way home. We also learned that one of the things, perhaps one of the only things that Susan brought with her from Poland was a little bag filled with plum pits. Imagine coming to a new world with the contents of a trunk. What could you bring? What would stay with you? What would remind you of the places you would never see again, the people you would never see again? So they brought plum pits from the old country and they planted them around the cabin. And there are, in fact, plum trees still growing there today. From Michael, I learn an astonishing array of facts and figures, not only about our lineage out of Poland. And I'm a storyteller. I am a romantic idealist. I love to weave that sort of thing. Just from our brief acquaintance now, Michael is more of he's a numbers man. He's facts and figures, and I hope that as this meeting, as we progress, that he will share some of his expertise, or you may ask him directly, how do you do that? He's been in contact with academics in Poland to find out where these people actually came from, this Fons family. When I was growing up, you got it in just little snips, okay? I knew that one of our ancestors made his living in Poland as he billed himself the strongest man in Poland. Imagine going around in the world of the 1800s, we'll say, pitting your strength against every challenge and every local tough that would come up against you. Here, bend this, lift this. I never knew that man's name, but my dad told me the story. And there were stories about my grandfather on the island who came out of that cabin. Gramps was a prodigiously strong man. And the stories were wonderful. That a dog came out of the woods one day when he was living in that cabin and bit one of his sisters. And Grandpa, who had been working with a pair of heavy gloves on, knelt down and baited the dog, coaxed the dog to come near. And when the dog came near, it bit Grandpa's hand. So Grandpa closed his fist around the muzzle of the dog, picked the dog up and killed it by slamming it against the corner of that cabin until it was dead. It was the frontier. And on the road gangs on Washington Island, he instructed one of the men to pick up a rock and move it off the right-of-way. And the man refused. He said the rock was too heavy. So Grandpa said, sit on it. And then he picked the rock up with the man sitting on it and carried it off the right-of-the-way and dropped them both. I could never hear that story without thinking about the wonderful day of the resurrection when the angel sat on the rock. If you got the strength, you just sit on it, just sit on it. I'll move it. I went to Dallas Seminary, a great school. I called it the West Point of seminaries. A lot of the men there were from traditional evangelical and ministerial families, and we had a daily chapel service. Imagine 400 guys wearing suits and ties singing the old hymns of the faith, and they'd get up and they'd offer their testimonies. Yeah, I remember learning the Bible stories at my father's knee. Oh, the good old days. And my grandfather, God bless him, a minister for 40 years and such of this and that. And I remembered my grandfather's knee, and I remember smoking his cigarettes with him and taking a taste of whiskey until Grandma came in from the kitchen and said, "My God, Jack, what are you doing?" And whereas some of the guys in seminary were learning the old rugged cross and onward Christian soldiers, I was learning drinking songs. And I'd sink down a little in my seat, but not for always, not forever, because seminaries come and go, but your grandfather, you thought he was God anyway, So I realized how proud I was of him and all the stories about Hans Maas and Lena. The stories, he'd tell the same stories every year, and you always had to act like you'd never heard them before, Hans asked Lena, "Would you care to dance?" "No," she said, "I don't think so. Because when I dance, I sweat so, and when I sweat, I stink so. I don't think so." The toast, the inevitable toast, here's to health, wealth, and unity, a dark night and a good opportunity. The way we fished, I had a little boat. It was called the John Edwin. It disappeared. It's kind of like the cabin, but it's probably under 10 feet of water. We would go out fishing in those days in Detroit Harbor, and we bait our hooks with some of Carmen's worms, and we'd throw the hook over the side, and Grandpa would count to 3. 1, 2, 3, and we'd pull in a fish. And we could do that for hours. We had strings of fish that we caught that were longer than I was as a boy. I have a picture of me trying to hold up one of those, and Grandpa did it for me. It was taller than I was. We took them home, we cleaned them, we ate them all. And if I tried to get Grandpa up too early to go fishing, he'd just wave me away and say that the fish need their breakfast too. go back to bed. And his favorite breakfast was cold bacon grease on burnt toast with a cup of black coffee and a Pall Mall cigarette, unfiltered. You get to love it because it's character. And the woman who put up with all that, Thelma Klingenberg, who walked a half a mile from the well with 2 buckets full of water on a shoulder yoke before she left the Klingenberg home and tripped as she came up the walk to her house, and both buckets hit the ground and spilled empty, and so she cried and walked the half mile back to the well because the family needs water today, and there's no other way to get it. So this is history, isn't it? It's not the dates, it's not the specifics, I'm sorry. Michael can help you with that. But it's the romance. It's the romance. One of the last times I saw my grandfather happy, he was sitting in a rental cabin. They had moved away from their home on the island, and we went up there on a vacation, and he and Dave Lucky were sitting at the kitchen table in that cabin near the ferry docks on the island side. They were both under strict doctor's orders. Grandpa had a pacemaker in his heart. It looked like a pack of cigarettes that they had embedded under his flesh. He'd tap it and he'd say, "Don't that beat hell?" And Dave had perforated ulcers. They were both under strict doctor's orders, and we made the wonderful mistake of leaving a bottle of Crown Royal whiskey in the kitchen with them, and when we came back, half of it was gone, and they were happy as clams. They were just sitting there roaring with laughter, slapping their knees and talking about the good old days. Days when a man worked, if he could get it, for $1 a day, until he hurt himself or got sick, and then he got nothing at all. When my grandparents lived on St. Martin's Island, Gramps was the foreman of a lumber camp there, and Grandma cooked for 26 men and raised her 2 boys in those cabins, which I think still stand there, although St. Martin's is now is restricted. What we know as history up here is just the day before yesterday. When my grandmother became pregnant with her 3rd child, she miscarried, and she became desperately ill on Washington Island in the winter in probably the mid-1920s. There was no doctor. And so the way they brought my grandmother Thelma to the mainland for help was they bundled her into a Model T, and they strapped 2 big wooden planks on the side of that car, and they drove to the water and they drove out onto the ice. And every time they encountered open water, they shot those planks out to the next ice floe, and they drove across death's door and got Grandma to help, and she lived. And that was, like I say, in terms of history, about the day before yesterday. You all know stories like that. You all have people like that. You all remember what it was like. It's important to remember, because it's important to have these foundations. Things work together. I want to show you a couple more things up there, and then I'll make my conclusion. This is one of the axle nuts off of that wagon. They're probably laying around Washington Island in Door County. Weighs about 3.5, 4 pounds. And this thing hadn't moved probably in a good 80 years, maybe more. And I figured, I'm never going to get that off of there. I'm never going to be able to unthread that nut off that axle rod. But fortunately, I had this wrench that belonged to my grandfather and sat in our garage in Houston, Texas for half a century. Nobody used it because what in the heck do you do with this thing? And yet, if you wait long enough, it became the very wrench I used to pop that nut off that axle. And the way I could do it was, I anticipated getting a piece of galvanized pipe, a cheater they call it, maybe 3 or 4 feet long, breaking both my arms trying to move this thing. And yet I put this wrench on this nut and exerted just enough pressure to get serious, and it moved. And the reason why it moved, ladies and gentlemen, is because the last guy who put this nut on that axle, we'll say in about 1910, he probably dipped his thumb in a bucket of axle grease and he put a smear of grease on those threads. Bless his heart. He did the right job back then, and because he did the right job back then, he made my job a lot easier right now. That's history. That's part of what that is. And I brought this. This is what's left of one of the members of that wagon. So you can, you've seen it. You see a shipwreck, you see this. Nature is pretty cruel to its own, but this is a piece of the wagon. You're free to look at that later. So I've got all the wood I need. I'll recarve it and re-drill it and everything else, and we'll put that wagon back together. I want to leave you with an impression about the importance of foundations. We're Americans. We're reckless. We like to use things up, and we like to throw them away and get on with our lives. But we come from such good people, such determined, frugal, honest, dependable, loyal, stalwart people, that if we dare forget for a minute the essential goodness of who we came from and how much they paid for us to be here, and I'm not talking about war. I honor my veterans, our veterans, but I'm talking about women who baked bread for 40 years or canned every fall throughout their married lives, or darned socks because they couldn't afford new ones. That sort of loyalty, that sort of honor and duty. It's very important now to be able to look back and understand what elements of the past are worthy and good to carry into the future. If we don't, we jeopardize an awful lot. For one thing, it's inefficient. Why do we have to relearn this stuff? They told it to us, if we just remember. I came up here to write a book a couple of years ago. There was a lady in Egg Harbor. She's got a big house. It was my mother's favorite boutique. And it started out with a casual conversation between Jane and Gloria Hanson. Maybe I could write a story about that house. So I started out to do it, and that's how I got into this. The story just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it led to this log cabin, it led to the Bailey's Harbor Historical Society, it led to the whole blessed state of Wisconsin and what it took to come into this place and try to make a life. So I want to read you just a couple paragraphs of the manuscript that was produced, and then we'll see what happens. Don't give up, America. Don't ever give up. Remember what it felt like for Thomas Alva Edison to throw the switch and see the filament keep burning. Remember what it felt like for Alexander Graham Bell to shout into the next room, "Mr. Watson, come here. I need you." And Watson came in, astonished, and said, "I heard you." And he meant he heard Bell through the wire. Remember what it felt like for Orville to look up and see Wilbur sailing away under power, and Wilbur to look down and see Orville waving his cap madly and running and trying to shout all at the same time, "We did it! We did it! We did it!" All with exclamation points and hurrah after hurrah. Remember what it meant for Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in the world, to give away every last cent before he died. Remember the tight smile across the lips of Henry Ford when he mounted an internal combustion engine on a frame with 4 wheels, a steering gear, and a gearbox. And it ran. And he realized how he could make more than anyone but he could imagine, and more money than even he could imagine. But he didn't stop smiling that tight little smile, and he said, "Things bust and the devil drives." Remember, Eli Whitney and Henry Fulton and William Tecumseh Sherman and Paul Revere and Alvin York and the unknown soldier. Remember, all the names in all the cemeteries, or all the names in one cemetery, or just one of the names, your own name, as it will appear someday in the list of those born and those who died in the United States of America. And don't give up. Don't give up, America. Don't ever give up. Don't give up. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce my cousin Michael here. Michael, you want to stand up? And Roxanne? They've been in this county since Sunday, doing what they love to do, I take it, and studying and meeting with people. And I think we maybe have some living relatives here that you met, huh?
Actually, we don't,
Okay.
but we met this morning with
I'm
Martin
going to give you the
Schramm.
microphone. Would
Okay.
I give you the microphone, please? So you can speak right into it. Get it real close to the mouth, okay?
Actually, we don't have any living relatives right here. The closest one would be Martin Schramm, who's actually Martin III. His grandfather is who John talked about living close to his great-grandfather's cabin. And we spent about 2 hours with him this morning, and he's 94 years old and remembers visiting with Pauline Fons Schramm, who is the sister of my great-grandfather. So John's great-grandfather John and my great-grandfather Joseph were brothers of Pauline von Schramm. So that's kind of how we got connected. I've been doing some genealogy on the family for about 5 years and have followed the Fonses all the way back to Poland to try to get some perspective. And when I saw that John was on the schedule for giving this presentation, thought this was perfect, and shared some information with him. And as he said, a lot of what I did was nuts and bolts, facts and figures. But unlike John, I never knew any of my grandparents. So it was more difficult for me to get a lot of the soft stories except from my father. But a lot of aspects of our family were very similar. His great-grandfather's younger brother, Joseph, came over in 1881, and he worked 55 years in a foundry in Milwaukee. And John mentioned a breakfast that his great-grandfather had, or his grandfather. My great-grandfather would have a cold bowl of sauerkraut and a shot of whiskey before he walked 18 blocks or whatever it was to the foundry to work a 12-hour day and 10 hours on Saturday. So there's a lot of those soft stories that were related, but they were related secondhand from my father, because I never knew either my grandfather or my great-grandfather.
I want to, I'll make some of these things available. It's intimidating when you get from a relative you've never met a fact sheet like this that tells you all the dates and places and names in Poland where your ancestors came from. Grandpa Fons, he moved to Chicago just at the Depression, did pretty well down there because he was a custodian for a number of brownstone apartment units down there. And the way Grandpa earned extra money was he prize fought. He'd go into these bars that had a ring, cordoned off, and he'd duke it out. And I can remember sitting on my grandfather's knee in Chicago watching the Friday night fights brought to you by Pabst Blue Ribbon Beer and Gillette, the little parrot that walked across the screen announcing the round number. And Grandpa said he quit doing it because he said it was a hard way to earn 20 bucks. 20 bucks to go into a ring with a guy who could kill you. I mean, you see, it's glorious to have to bear stories like that in a computerized world. It's glorious when you hear about men who work 12 and 14-hour days on cold sauerkraut and whiskey. When you sit in a restaurant and hear people trying to finicky their way through a menu, I can't eat that, I won't have that, I don't like this, you know. Last night, and I guess, you know, last night we were at Al Johnson's, and there were two guys working outside to refinish the outside of Al Johnson's. It was 8 o'clock at night, and they were still climbing those ladders. They had on painters' hoods, respirators. They're going up and down those ladders at 8 o'clock, and all around them, there were men with their ladies, their wives on their arms, people at leisure, people spending lots of money, and these guys are duking it out. It's still there.
It's a grandson.
It takes, that's what it takes in the world. Sooner or later, somebody's got to know how to do it. Now my sister Valerie is here. Valerie she lives on Washington Island.
Could you stand up?
Yes, please, Valerie.
Please stand up.
And Valerie's had battles of her own in her life with health, but one of the things that my sister Valerie has done, and this was now almost 30 years ago, she and her husband paddled 2 canoes from the Arctic Circle to the tip of Cape Horn, to the tip of South America, Cape Horn, over a period of 2.5 years. Somewhat, 28,000 river miles, and the 2-continent canoe expedition. So the wonder and the tenacity and the courage of life is all around us. Jane Meyer has been program director at the Epilepsy Foundation in Madison for basically 25 years, dealing with people with profound issues regarding epilepsy and other disabilities.
Stand up.
Okay? So, again, in terms of sermons, it does no good just to study what it used to be and how people used to believe. You got to apply it somehow. So I want to encourage you as historians, whether you're members of the Bailey's Harbor Historical Society or not, whatever your path toward the past, do please try to apply it to your present and your future, because that's where the treasure is. That's where the value is, the challenge, and sometimes the thrill, okay? Because you're going to be doing something that nobody else knows how to do, quite often, or won't, because it's just, because they're not comfortable with it, okay? I'm just not comfortable with that. You know, you didn't know my grandfather. You didn't know his wife. And I never knew, Michael, I never knew my maternal grandfather, Edwin Hansen, who died at the age of, I think, 54. He worked himself to death. He knew he had a bad heart. There was nothing he could do about it. And my 13-year-old uncle at the time, Edwin Theodore Hansen, he held his father when he died and swore at my grandfather said to him, "Take care of your mother and your brother and sister, Sonny." And that was it. So we got a lot to live for.
John, we know your family now. We know your family.
All right.
You know?
Thank you.
Because you told us.
Yes. All right. So, yeah. That's what we get. That's the treasure we get. And the times that I'm like, you know, the times in which we live are fraught with the discord and the disharmony and the sacrifices we have made at the altars of convenience and distraction. And the families that we look back upon, if we can just evoke some of what it is that they lived. It's a stabilizing and a strengthening influence, I believe. So in that lies the treasure, and I hope that the work of the Bailey's Harbor Historical Society continues, because if you can do for anybody what you've done for me, then you are truly to be honored. Thank you.
I just want to thank you, John, for an absolutely fantastic program. I can't tell you how much It means to all of us here because we all have a history. And when you hear the stories, your story, your story, your story, it makes it so important for us to realize how much the history of a town means to all of the people that live here. And we can only play it forward. And I looked at my grandson tonight and I thought, this is your history too. You're a part of this family and you're a part of this community. And that we need to do this and we need to write it down. It makes us want to write down the stories of our families so the people that come after us have something to look at and relate to.
One of the things you can do, to me it turned out into a comedy. I suffered a debilitating illness, and in my recuperation, Jane brought me a stack of family photographs. I didn't even want to look at them because I was tired, and the problem was that most of those people in those photographs, I had no idea who they were. So if you got photographs, ID them. If you know who those people are, please write it down, maybe where the photograph was taken, or a guy like me will get a hold of them, because what I did, I figured everybody deserves a family, and if I don't know the family, I'm going to make one up. So I took 100 photographs, and I wrote a piece called Ancestry, okay? I changed the spelling, and if I saw a dapper guy in a bowler hat with a cane and two pretty ladies on his arm, I just figured, okay, he's my uncle, he was a gambler, he ended up shot in San Francisco or something. I just made it up. And I said, but that's okay. Nobody else told me, and nobody's gonna tell me, they're all gone. So, you know, beware, there are guys like me out there who'll just make it up. But one more thing. Okay. History is wonderful, and facts are wonderful. But like I said, you have a version. You have a version, and you have a right to that version of what it is you think about what has happened. Because when you think about it, and you look back into history, and you think about the great images that we have of, we'll say, Victorian England. Okay. It was Charles Dickens. He was writing fiction, but it was based upon the facts. If you want to go back to Imperial Russia, it's going to be Leo Tolstoy. He's writing fiction. If you want to go to America, the frontier through the Mississippi, it's Mark Twain. He's writing fiction, folks, but somehow through the wonderful medium of the human soul, those fictional accounts become the signature images of the times, the historic times. And it may be that story that draws you back into the factual research that, wow, ends wherever you may care. But so it's an art, okay? It's a wonderful process by which fiction becomes the signature of a historic time.